So I guess what I've been thinking about lately is, well, just so the viewers know, we've been talking about 1984 a lot with everything that's going on, 2020 being this crazy year. And together, I think we came up with a really interesting question. And it's something like, how much are you actually a citizen of a society, or how much are you actually intertwined with a society if you rebel against the cultural norms? If you don't adhere to the overarching philosophy that represents that society?
That's a really good question, and I'm glad that we're bringing it up today.
Yeah.
For one, I want to say 1984 is a rockin' book. If nobody has ever actually read that book, we'll put a link in the description, and you should really check it out. In fact, I bought my third copy today.
Yeah, you have a problem.
I know, at a thrift store. I have 4 copies, actually, but somebody is holding on to one of them, and I'm probably never going to get it back.
Sure.
So
you have 3 copies.
Yeah, I got 3 copies. Whatever, no big deal. But every time I buy them, though, the reason why I buy them is because I only buy them if I find them in a thrift store already pre-annotated. I don't buy them brand new.
Okay.
So it's like, if I find that particular book and it's annotated, I've been buying them because I'm really interested at sort of juxtaposing different views while I have different, people's opinions, basically.
Right.
I'm just trying to look at them, skim it, be like, oh, that's a cool note, because I pretty much know the book back and forth. Like,
right.
You know what I mean?
But it highlights something that maybe stuck out to somebody else more than it stuck out to you.
Exactly, and I'm always curious. I love buying annotated books.
Right.
Usually, if I only have one copy of a book that's annotated, I'll like buy another copy of it brand new or something just to have it, because I like to annotate books. Right. But yeah, man, it's just one of those books I buy over and over.
It's iconic. I mean, it's one of the most prophetic works of fiction that I think I've ever come across, like with the telescreens, except, obviously the only difference is that they're in our pocket. They're not all over the walls. I mean, they actually are all over the walls, but they're also in our pockets. And it's this idea that, for anyone who's never read it, should we just...
Sure, yeah.
I mean, it's this idea that...
We'll do a book review, but...
all information in the world is filtered through these 4 institutions. And any inkling of rebellion against those ideas can be met with really harsh consequences.
Like death.
Or
torture.
Or
Or your whole family being slaughtered. Kind of like North Korea.
Right. I mean, someone could see you having a twitch and be like, oh, that guy's definitely... he's got something going on
Something's
up here.
Happening.
He's committing what they call in the book a thought crime. There's actually a institution called the thought police, and they make sure that everyone thinks the right way, and if they don't, you're out.
You get snatched.
Right.
And go ahead with your thought, though.
No, you're good.
I'll jump in. Okay, so with the four agencies, or they're called ministries, if nobody's actually read the book, the names of those industries, their titles, are the complete opposite of what they actually are set out to achieve.
Right.
So, like, you've got the Ministry of Peace, which is really about creating warfare constantly, and you've got
the illusion of warfare.
Right. The illusion, which we don't want to spoil the book for anybody, but you've also got the Ministry of Love, and
which is all about hate.
Yeah, and all the ministries have different names for what they actually do. And in the book, there are concepts like doublethink, doublespeak, and newspeak. And newspeak is one that I kind of want to highlight a little bit today when we talk about stuff.
Definitely.
But newspeak is basically like a brand new lexicon. It's a new dictionary. It's a new vocabulary in which this one guy, it's his job. He gets paid, I guess. Like, sure, he gets paid to do a job in which he basically redefines the dictionary of approved usable terminology that people in the actual society get to use.
Right.
And that's a crazy concept to me. Because it talks, it goes into the depths of language, how we utilize language to think about ideas. If our language is limited, then that's going to limit the degree in which we can think of ideas and that entire gambit. So,
yeah, it reminds me of a conversation I had with a guy from India. We were talking about the Bhagavad Gita, and I asked him a question, and he basically told me that there was no way that I could ever conceptualize the answer unless I knew how to speak his language.
Right.
So I mean, it's just, we're limited by our language to a certain degree. And in this book, people catch on to that idea and they manipulate the language so that your thoughts are limited to certain
and we should actually do another episode about this, or maybe even talk about it later in this one. But so as not to go on such a deep tangent. But yeah, definitely. In the book, the concept is basically, if you limit people's ability to think with words, let's say you remove completely any type of language that would aspire to or allude to the higher faculties of thought, like morality, ethics, or even something like anguish
or rebellion.
If you get rid of the word rebellion, or anything that could ever allude to that in a person's mind state, then the idea is you would limit the options that they have in the pool of words in order to quantify or really understand a feeling that they have.
Right.
Because we're very language-oriented creatures.
Right.
And if you don't have a word for a feeling that you have, you can't quite necessarily understand it in a way that would interface with the rest of your mode of being.
Right.
Like, we have feelings that we can't quite put our thumbs on. We have intuitions, and we have, I don't know, like divine inspiration. And some people are able to think without thinking.
Right. Well, you can be conditioned to not have those things. I mean, it's like the idea of Plato's allegory of the cave. If your whole life is predicated on an illusion and someone tries to show you the truth, you won't even know how to conceive such a thing. You would actually rather ultimately go back to the illusion because it's all that makes sense. It's all that ever made sense, and it's all you ever had.
Exactly. And so that's kind of what the goal is behind Newspeak with that new dictionary. And double think and double speak is all about, saying things that you don't mean or holding two contradictory notions at the same time, which in my opinion, I think is actually, the best way to be.
Agreed.
But in the book, George Orwell, the author, paints it in sort of a negative light.
Right.
So not to get too deep into the book, right? I mean, there's so much nuance in that book that's just absolutely incredible.
But the question is,
totalitarian, authoritarian regimes, you should read the book.
You should read the book. But the question ultimately is, if I don't do what society tells me to do, and I don't think the way society tells me to think or wants me to think, how am I not to be considered a free agent, if you will?
I mean, that's a good question. So citizenship, right, if you read Plato's Republic or any political science text in the modern day or any of the older ones like Plato, to be a citizen really is to kind of find this balance between like your own personal sovereignty and conforming to the rule set that's arbitrated or like arbitrarily put together by the greater good.
Right,
by the whole of the people and what that means. And I think it was Diogenes, which was the pre-Socratic philosopher who basically like would piss on people in the street and run. They called him the
masturbate in the market.
Yeah,
and
like
stuff.
he would just do insane things.
Right.
He was like the epitome of anarchy. He was the epitome of I do whatever I want to. And he's fortunate that he lived in a different time because if I did that right now, I'd go to prison for like pedophilia for flashing my dick
The archive
to people.
would be no more.
Yeah, I would be in prison, fighting for my life because I'm pretty.
Yeah.
And they'd be trying to get me. Prison's not my spot, bro.
Yeah, neither.
It's actually my greatest fear. No, I'm not going to put that in the word now.
Let's not put that out there. It's my greatest fear too, though.
Cancel. But yeah, so that is a good question. So if you're going to be a sovereign individual, and especially in a place like America, right, where our entire set of options or the majority of people's worldview is around freedom of speech, being able to do whatever you want to within reason, being free, essentially, being able to make your own decisions and have autonomy, but you still can't do certain things.
Well, you also still rely on the systems that are in place to propagate. So like my take on it is partially this, like, right now, especially right now, but even before COVID, you could live your whole life inside. You could have a work from home job, or you could not have a job and have somebody else take care of you, and you could have all your groceries delivered. You could order everything you ever need on Amazon, but at the same time, you still are relying on all the things that the rest of your society has put in place to be alive.
Which it's a fair trade, right? I mean, that's why we are required to sign up for the draft when we become 18 years old. I think it's literally illegal to not within a certain time frame. I think it's like 2 years you have to sign up for the draft, or maybe 6 months even. I don't know exactly. I signed up for the draft, but you have to if you're an American citizen and you're not disabled.
I don't know if I have. I probably shouldn't say that. But go ahead.
I think you have to, if I'm not mistaken. But it's that same concept, right? Like you have to serve if your country needs you because you're reaping the benefits of living in that country.
Sure.
And we're lucky enough, human beings are all about land, and we attach to objects and we attach meaning to arbitrary things in the world to, I don't know, create our social constructs and our gender roles and everything like that. And we just so happen to be the type of people who also attach to land. And so geographical location matters. And if you're born on this soil, you're a citizen of this nation.
Right.
And you have an option to leave because you live in a free society, in a free nation where, yes.
At least in most places.
Hopefully you do if you're watching this. If not, shout outs to us somehow and we'll maybe come try to save you. Or something.
Let us know.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it's all about like where you live, where you're born. And then if you're free, you have an option to leave, right? Through whatever the process is.
Right.
If you choose to stay, then to some degree, you really should conform to that society's social constructs, like military service membership or the draft or whatever. And I agree to you, because you're just utilizing resources. So,
but there are people who go out into the woods and survive.
Sure, like Ralph Waldo Emerson or something.
Sure, and I guess here's another question, and this is one I actually don't know the answer to, but is there any part of the world that's unclaimed? Where you could go live that's not owned by any country?
No, I don't think so. I think to some degree, like all of the actual landmass on Earth has been claimed as territory by some subset of nations. I don't think there's any real...
So at the same time, like even if you went to move out in the woods and you were self-sustainable and you were growing your own food or hunting your own food, you're still living in somebody's claimed property.
So, but then there's some nuance there, because now you're talking about things that are outside of your control wholly. Mm-hmm. Like you're self-sustaining, you're living by yourself, but you're still somehow interconnected with society, because humankind is proliferated so much, and there's so many people on planet Earth, and there's so much there's great enough amounts of land for all of us to live in abundance, but there's so many people now, I think, that you still are going to encroach on someone else by just fishing your lot.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
If you just kill enough game for yourself to eat every year, or if you just pull enough fish out, or you utilize enough land for your crops, there's still some secondary effect that you're going to have on other people. Even if you're not on the grid consuming energy, even if you're not necessarily paying taxes or not paying taxes, like there's still some repercussion.
Right.
And you still have some effect. And so I think that I understand like the government's predisposition to be like, we don't want anyone doing these things without permits, or we don't want anyone doing these things without our knowledge, because ultimately if everyone were doing those things, chaos could ensue quickly.
Right.
But so there is a fine line, right, between ordinance and order and governing people and self-sustaining anarchy. Where do you draw that line? And it's a good question.
Yeah, it reminds me, Louis C.K. has a joke where he says that when you rent a car, you're supposed to go through this process, but he just drove his car to the airport and got in the plane and then called the car rental place and was like, I'm already gone. And he's like, but if everybody did that, the world would be chaos. Like, you should act in such a way that if everybody acted that way, things would fall apart.
Things would be terrible.
Yeah.
Absolutely terrible. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the best way to be a citizen, right? Like, that's the best way that we can behave. Sort of utilitarian, like, we can give up things for the greater good, but there's a lot of people out there who have problems with that.
But then at the same time, there's some rules that no matter where you live, you're going to disagree with those rules.
Sure.
And the question, I guess, becomes is it immoral to act outside of those rules in every circumstance? And I personally think the answer is no. But I think you can conform to a certain degree where it makes the parts where you don't conform justifiable.
So, like misdemeanors versus felonies.
Sure, or like smoking marijuana in a state where it's illegal.
Sure. So like misdemeanors versus felonies, kind of, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Like gross issues that, if you're breaking the law, it's not so bad. And if you do. So I think that our justice system has the right idea with setting up hierarchical things. Like, if you break this law, it's not quite as bad. So maybe you get a ticket or a fine, non-moving violations.
Yeah, well, part of being a citizen is if you are going to break a law, you kind of know that you're taking that risk that could lead to potential consequences.
Yeah. So. But you're still a citizen.
Right.
And what's funny to me, though, is that I don't really think we have any judicial system in place where if you do, there's not a crime that is egregious enough to actually lose your citizenship. I don't think there is one. I think you just become imprisoned for life or get the death penalty.
Yeah, death penalty, yeah.
But then you're still a citizen. And I think that has to do with money and making, generating revenue and monetization and, because there's for-profit prisons.
It also has to do with the fact that we just answered the question is that there's no unclaimed land. So if there were all these people who didn't conform, it's like, where would you send them?
Right. Yeah, no doubt.
Where could they go?
It would be inhumane to just dump them off in Mexico. But then you might cause problems with Mexico, and now Mexico wants to come fight you and start a war because you keep dumping your convicts on their soil. Or you
could just I can imagine like now a fiction book idea is coming to me where like the whole world agrees that this one remote island is the place where you just send everybody who just can't conform. They're not necessarily malevolent or evil, but they just have proven themselves to be unable to conform so much that that's where they go.
Do you think that enough people would go there with the correct mindset? Because most of the time criminals are extremely intelligent, at least. I misspoke. Not most of the time, but sometimes you can have hyper intelligent criminals. who can organize crime.
Sure.
And so do you think that if in your book, maybe one of the major plot points would be at some point an empire is erected out of that soup of riffraff trash?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's
Or-
not my book anymore. Someone who's watching is definitely
Sure.
going to write that. But
Or yeah, maybe. Or would it be that like they were all such ruffians that absolute chaos and anarchy would constantly ensue, and you would maybe more so now the book is about the moral dilemma of doing this more so than like some actual consequence occurring. You know what I mean?
yeah.
What would be the plot point?
Or maybe they stumbled upon some psychedelic that nobody had ever encountered before, and it just radically changed their perspective.
Change
and
all
now,
of them.
And now they want to come back, but there's no way to communicate. You know,
That'd be crazy.
that would be actually a pretty good.
That would actually work if their level of communication was built into some like AI process or some computerized system of some computerized application. Like when you're integrated in the society, everyone can speak the same language
Sure.
through whatever technology or process. But then like when you get booted out of the civilization, they remove the processing chip that allows you to understand their language or something.
Yeah.
So then like you literally can't communicate with them anymore. So now you have like maybe this huge at the top of the hierarchy, corrupted, hyper elite who are creating this illusion that these people are ruffians and terrible, and really they're just like getting rid of defectors, and
Yeah.
then now it's like there's no way for these people to actually help the other people because there's like language barriers, and there's an illusion of they're evil.
That's
but really
almost
they're
like
good.
taking 1984 to the modern time and,
Yeah,
and expanding
that'd be a cool
upon
idea.
it. Yeah. So
Somebody, if they don't steal that idea, shit, man, I might write that
Yeah, go ahead.
into my book.
go ahead.
Maybe for everybody that's
We can
out there.
collaborate on a
Yeah,
fiction book.
I have a lot of ideas for my sci-fi book, but I've never actually started it. It's just outlined. But that was kind of
You
a cool
should
idea.
write that. That's a cool idea. So I think what we've kind of established is that, first of all, the obvious, we're social creatures. We can't really escape the mechanisms that we put in place as a society. Everybody's claimed all the land, so there's really nowhere you can go you're completely free. But I guess my question is, and I'll just coin this term right now, the Tarzan question. What would happen if a person was born and grew up in a place where there were no other humans to influence them, and they really had no societal structure? I mean, do you even think it's possible to prosper in an environment like that as a human being?
Yeah, absolutely. Because we're still social creatures, right? There's still other people there. There's just no language, or I guess what
if there's no people there? I mean,
if it's just you by yourself?
Yeah.
You'd probably die.
you think?
Yeah, probably.
Because we're kind of like weak and slow. And,
Yeah, dude. If you
you
had
know.
yeah, we're very much social creatures.
Right.
Since it's sort of like the great chain of being,
Right.
right? Like Arthur Lovejoy's
So
idea.
anybody who becomes a hermit couldn't have done so without knowledge that they gained from a society that they grew up in.
Totally. I think that's a big concept for
Yeah.
sure. Like we are babes when we're born. We have to suckle on a teat. We need milk.
Sure.
We can't eat substance. That's a very Masonic idea of the Freemasons. There's a metaphor in which the masses are called the blind force, and those people are akin to babes who require milk to survive for sustenance. And then there are the adults or the men or the free ones, the Freemasons, who are self-actualized, and they can sustain themselves off of bread. And so that being said, like those people who are akin to babes who need milk for sustenance, it's like it's their nature to need to be controlled or to be swayed or to be corralled like chatteled, tools to be used, basically to be cultivated. And that idea, I think, translates to what you're saying, that no matter what we do, it's kind of like,
Yeah.
I know I'm going on fat tangents really quick, but it's kind of like Immanuel Kant's idea of a priori knowledge, which is the idea of, can knowledge be held that is outside of empirical experience?
Right.
Right. And there are examples of a priori and arguments for it. But most of the time, people misunderstand Kant when he says that, because even he recognizes that through his system of trying to explain what a priori knowledge is, you could have only gotten to a point to even understand that concept via language, via a system of reasoning, which you would have only been able to have come to in a physical form through propagation of sound waves, through a system in the physical material world in which you came to understand those ideas through. So even if those experiences or ideas themselves are outside of sense experience and empirical experience themselves, in order to have gotten to a point to understand that, you have to do that through through empirical processes and systems.
Right.
It's like you can never get away from that. It's kind of like what you're saying. You can never get away from people.
Right.
You can never get away from them.
And you can never get away from the material universe, which, for whatever reason, gives us the circumstances that allows us to come to these specific ideas.
Right. We're attached.
Right.
We are here.
Right.
That's why Ram Dass is so famous for his book, Be Here Now. You know what I mean?
Right.
Because we have no choice. And that's one of my major philosophies that I'm getting across in my book, my set of 3 philosophy texts. One is it's just the nature of being.
Right.
And that's why I asked the question on Facebook, which spurred that huge discussion, which is, I said to exist is to be a slave. And I didn't mean anything negative by that. I didn't mean like we're slaves, that we don't have any autonomy, or that we're not free or sovereign. It's that
it just means that the circumstances that are bestowed upon you are inescapable.
You cannot ever escape them.
Right.
And if you exist, you are a slave to some process that is beyond you.
You could even go to another planet and you would still be constrained by the physical universe.
Exactly. To be, you are constrained to being.
Right.
Like
and you still have your body and your brain, the way that it works, the way that it operates. There's
you need lungs to breathe. You need oxygen. You're a slave to oxygen. You're a slave to your brain. You're a slave to electricity.
Perhaps changes that, but
and so there's a bunch of books out there like that talk about this concept of slavery and mastery, in which no matter what you do as a being in reality, there will always be someone or something above you,
right?
That you are subservient to or subordinate to,
right?
And just like whether it be a force or a deity or a president or something. Yes, we have personal autonomy. I'm not a slave in the sense that like my arm is a slave to my ego and my brain and my heart. That I tell my arm what to do and it moves. We're slaves to the actual literal facet of being itself,
right?
Kind of like what you're getting.
Yeah, well, it's like your heart is gonna beat regardless of whether you want it to or not.
Exactly.
Breath is a weird thing though, because you can stop breathing for a moment of time, but the moment your conscious awareness goes away from breathing, you continue breathing, kind of like thinking. You can control your thoughts to a certain degree, but at the same time, once you stop thinking about thinking,
it just happens.
It just bestows itself upon you. Yeah.
Which is why 2 things to be said there. One, breathing and being able to control that. It's why it's the most fundamental metaphor in all of the wisdom cultures and religious orders.
And it's a meditation too, to focus on your breath.
Very meditational. Because it's like the one thing about you that's autonomous, but also can be controlled and in the physical form. So it's not the only, but one of the, and it's definitely chained to actual life. Like if we stop breathing, we die. So it's this big metaphor. In Hinduism, you've got like the different breath techniques, and Om, which is the primordial sound, which most people know Om from the third eye chakra, and the New Age, very new agey,
yeah.
And even in Kabbalah or Judaism or Christianity, Ruach, which means like breath, or spirit. It's like not spirit, but like the breath, which is understood as what people might consider spirit, or like the breath of God, the breath of life. There's so many different things. God uttered into existence things through
which requires breath.
Which breath.
Right.
And so it's a big symbol, but we're slaves to breathing, but we can control it. But we're slaves to being, right? We can kill ourselves or die on accident or whatever, and now we no longer exist as we exist now. But even then, what I posit in what I meant to say on Facebook in the comments was, even if you die, at some point in reality, if you subscribe to time not being linear from like point A to point B, but being like a soup of all time in the higher dimensional states, like the 4th to the 5th dimension, then at some level, every action that you've ever made, every movement you've ever taken, everything you've ever thought is in some way, shape, and form actually like solidified forever in space and time in some sub pocket here and there. Some people might disagree on the nature of time.
But a scientific rationalist would say that, anything that exists, including your thoughts, exist in this material universe. So your memories, your thoughts, your emotions, when you die, they're still somehow latched onto this universe so that it doesn't go away.
Right. I mean, they're still somehow there forever.
It just transmutes into other energy. I postulate maybe a different theory, which says that, there is an external meme space or mind space that, is not necessarily attached to this universe in a direct way, or maybe it is, but it's still to be considered a separate place for pragmatic reasons.
Sure. Yeah, so that concept, there's 2 ways that I can explain it with pre-existing jargon. One is the Akashic record,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a very New Age thing again.
Which is kind of like the archetypal universe.
Right. For anybody listening, the Akashic record is exactly what Connor's explaining. It's sort of like the idea of the archangel Metatron in the Old Testament. Like there's a subspace in reality somewhere in which all knowledge exists already forever. Anything that ever is data that needs to be absorbed and understood and reflected is existing in this giant library in a metaphysical hyperdimensional space, and that's called the Akashic record.
Which is kind of interesting, because when people take psychedelics, one of the things they often report is that when they were in that space, they knew everything there is to know. They had all the knowledge in the universe, but they can't bring it back. It doesn't translate back.
Yeah, they can't bring it back. And some people with lucid dreams, and people who get there in their dream states, or who claim to have
or
astral projections,
meditative states, or
yeah, exactly. And whether or not they're deluded or they actually achieved that place, they reached it and they just couldn't bring it back into their finite mental state again. Who knows? But that's the Akashic record, right? And then Plato's theory of knowledge, which is that anything that we ever actually discover is not really a discovery, but like a remembrance of something that already existed in that space. So he kind of, it sort of like aligns with Plato's theory of forms and his theory of knowledge, in which all knowledge already exists outside of us.
Well, that just makes sense. I mean, if we are a manifestation of the universe, then that means that anything that we could ever possibly conceive already was, because the universe already created the conditions for it to exist.
For the universe that already created the conditions for you to be able to have that idea. But
otherwise, we'd be somehow to be considered separate.
Yeah,
like
somehow outside of.
Omnipotent.
We would be God.
Right.
Which we're not. We are of God.
We're certainly not.
Yeah.
That's very clear.
Very New Age thing for people to say is, I am God. Yeah. They take one tab of LSD and then they're like, I'm God. And they have like a solipsism moment.
Right, and there's like a truth in that, but the way that they're conceptualizing it is very dogmatic.
It's very solipsistic, which means they think, like, it's a delusion that a lot of people have when they first start doing psychedelics or going on a spiritual journey, in which they really believe like they are the only existing being on the earth. That like every other person is a figment of their own reality construct, that they are God and everything else is an illusion.
Right. It's very clear in esoteric text that that's not the takeaway. The correct takeaway, which really can't be empirically proven, but is established in esotericism and whatnot, is that you're a fragment of God. You're an emanation of God.
Of God.
Yeah.
All things are emanations if you subscribe to the monotheistic idea, or at least the monad of like Pythagoras, in which or the primordial ground, right? The prima materia, the one thing, the
Tao.
Yeah, the Tao, like whatever you might call it, God, Yod-He Vav-He, the whatever. But yeah, so with all that being said, with the nature of reality to be, and we're slaves to being, and there's all these things that interplay with all of that, it's obvious that reality's complicated, and if we are a part of it, and it's already all of the conditions for us to come into emergence from dead matter to living matter to self-aware matter to metacognitive self-aware matter, which is us, people, versus animals, versus plants, versus dead immaterial matter, or dead matter. Whatever that process is, all of the conditions for our thoughts are already interwoven into that process. So we might posit and assume that we only are rediscovering things that already exist outside of us.
And I'd like to connect a few dots here just for a moment. So we've kind of already established that it just makes sense that any discovery made is actually not a discovery, as Plato postulated. It's more of something that's a remembrance of, or something that we just innately have the ability to discover, because once again, the universe created the conditions for it. To bring that back to society, it kind of makes sense to me that any societal construct is just something like, if let's say you adhere to your society, the only reason you even have the capacity to do that is because for some reason the universe constructed us in such a way that would make it to be so. That would make it either to have utility to be so, or just some coincidence that would happen.
Through whatever process of evolution occurred. Which is why I really enjoy the term evolution in a way that's not scientifically dogmatic. For anyone who's like, science isn't dogmatic. Yes, it is. It is. But yeah, I mean, evolution, or God, or the universe, or the cosmos, or whatever you want to call it, has this system of processes in which this whole thing is unfolding. So maybe we might say, yeah, okay, we're all we're all relearning things that are actually existing already outside of us in some actually tangible
and maybe
state.
we're the first ones to have a prefrontal cortex that allows us to think about it. But
it's like the metaphor in which our brains are receivers, and all knowledge or any idea that we have is like actually floating about in some hyperdimensional way or space, and we just tune into those frequencies, and they're because of the way that we actually exist in this sort of illusory state of Maya, which is the word for
the Hindu word for illusion.
And maybe because of the way that God configured this world, or the grand architect did, or whoever you subscribe to, or just it's the way that it is because nature is very inefficient and wasteful in the process of evolution. For whatever reason, we just tune into those things.
Right.
We're receivers.
Which to me makes just as much sense, if not more, than the idea that our brains somehow create a multitude of substances that interact with each other that generate the thoughts out of our body, which is kind of like the Cartesian idea. But to me, I mean, it's like, but it is it's a new agey thing to say the brain is not the mind, you know. But
but it isn't though.
Right, but it's not.
Yeah, and some people posit that you don't even need a brain to have a mind.
Well, they've shown that you can cut all of the brain off of a cat except for the hypothalamus, and the cat functions pretty much the same.
I'd have to look that up. That's insane.
It's pretty much the same, except the cat is more hyper exploratory. The cat is more interested in checking things out, and it's more risk. It takes more risks.
That's insane.
Yeah,
I have to look at that. I've never heard of that before. Wow. But yeah, to go back on that though, whether or not we're actually like rediscovering things or actually learning things, maybe just like you were saying, there's something to be said about how the whole process works and unfolds together. Like perhaps, and it's sort of the idea that I have sometimes, that it's like there is no heaven without mankind, in terms of when you read the Bible and you read these Western occult texts. It's like heaven is founded upon this world, and this world is also founded upon heaven, depending on the context that we're looking at things. And the idea is that without human beings, like if all mankind were to actually die, then there would be no heaven, because heaven is literally built off of the physical processes that are unfolding on earth in this moment. And all human beings, all sacks of skin and flesh and brain, soups and bones and everything, are all like cells in this body of Christ, or this body of God, in this hyperdimensional state in which every lifetime, every individual is akin to a single cell in this hyperdimensional construction, and that heaven is the unfolding emergent process out of every interaction, and hell is that as well, and the polar opposite of every interaction of humankind's actions on the earth. So the earth is sort of like this alchemical apparatus. It's sort of like an Erlenmeyer flask, and all of the humans or all of the events on the whole planet are sort of like the chemicals swishing about, and out comes this new thing emerging from it all. But it's all dependent upon and tangent to and contingent to the events that are occurring. So without human beings, there's no heaven, with this sort of idea. And maybe there are ideas out there that exist independent of us that we just tune into, or perhaps it's our process of actually existing and living that give life to those ideas that never did exist before.
And it's almost kind of akin to the idea that like we are the eyes of God, or that we are the universe experiencing itself subjectively, because maybe Plato postulated that these ideas always existed, but it took the universe to create a process that inevitably led to these beings that were able to actually think about them.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's just like a dream. And I agree with that tenet that like we are the universe. And we talked about that in an old video that we
are objectively the universe.
Yeah, we are of the universe.
No scientific rationalist or any logician can ever argue with that, because that is what we are at the fundamental level.
So to some degree, we are of the universe.
We're representations in our own idiosyncratic way, but
right. Sometimes, in some ways, we are of the universe because I'm just one person, and obviously the cosmos is so much larger than I am. But to another level, I am the whole universe, because if I die, as far as I know, the whole universe dies with me. My universe dies with me. So,
and when you were born, you were also an amalgamation of everything, including that table.
Yeah.
And these microphones.
Well, you were just a state of like potential energy.
Right.
Right. Like you didn't actually exist as anything. You were nothingness, which is a very next level physics concept of dark matter and dark energy, which is so funny to me because they're literally saying everything that the Kabbalists are saying. They're saying everything that the Hindus are saying,
right?
Just with a different lexicon, with different definitions, with different filters of looking at the world through their physical, materialistic, empirical processes, their positivist, reductionist attitudes. However, they're basically saying the same thing.
Right.
And ultimately, to me, it just sounds, it is sort of contradictory because it's like we come from nothing, but we are something. We come from dark matter, dark energy, this stuff that's like wholly outside of this system. And then somehow this system is born out of that process of nothingness, whether we're talking about science or philosophy or religion or whatever, it seems to boil down to this sort of honest to God contradictory notion of beingness, like where we came from, chicken or the egg. And it's like, everything is like that. Everything is cyclical. It's very much like the Ouroborus,
right?
The snake that eats its own tail. It's the alchemical symbol. Jung uses it a lot in his archetypes. And contradiction, being at the floor and the ceiling of reality, is like metaphysics 101 in my opinion. It is the highest truth. And when you say that to people, it really leaves like a bad taste in their mouth.
Right.
Or in your mouth when you say it. It's like, what does that even mean? Contradiction is truth. Like, you're batshit crazy.
Well, it's hard to put in a box, and that's why I think people don't like it right away, is because it's hard to keep organized.
Right. Well, it's also logically incorrect. Like you can't logically say that.
But it's also logically correct at the same time, which is
a contradiction.
Right.
If you try to ever even say that it is and make an argument for it, and then you can show it,
But that's the fundamental aspect of language, and that's one thing. When I was doing the daily discussion, I was talking to a lot of atheists, and I would get into these arguments with them, and I would get, pretty passionate and pretty upset. But then I started to get less and less upset, because what I realized is that we're actually almost saying the exact same thing. We're just using these slightly different verbiage. And then when I realized that, I started watching, like political debates, and I realized, oh, they're doing the same thing.
Right.
They're talking about the same thing. They're just saying it slightly differently.
Right. And that kind of did, give birth to our discussions later in life, which then gave birth to the Union of Opposites segment series, which this is not that, but shout out to our segment.
Shout out to the Union of Opposites for sure.
Yeah. So I mean, to bring it all back, I guess, to bring it back to the beginning of sovereignty and of being able to act on, of your own volition in accordance with what you feel like is right and wrong through your free will, if that even exists. I don't even want to jump into that topic right now, but being a citizen, being subject to systems that are larger than you, being a slave to systems that you cannot ever escape, that are older than you, that are larger than you, as you sort of try to swim around and survive and make the best of it. To bring it back to all of that, how does that make you feel, for one? And two, a lot of people find solace in it. They somehow find meaning in this sort of crazy, contradictory insanity that's so much bigger and larger than us. And some people find utter, just like, destitution, like straight up, what's the word that I'm looking for? Nihilism. People either go one of two ways, which again is polarities, right?
Right.
And you either kind of fall in the middle of that spectrum, or you're going to go that way towards self-destruction and just being wholly having disregard for everything, or you find meaning in everything. And so where are you on that spectrum?
I guess I do want to answer that question, but first of all, I just want to say, I think one of the things that I've learned just from having this conversation with you is that there's really no end to the systems that we adhere to.
Ever.
We started with the societal systems, and that's more tangible, right? Because it's right in front of us. We see the politics around us. We see that people adhere to these philosophies and these laws and these rules. But beyond that, we have the physical constraints, which is the metaphysical constraints for that matter, and the psychological constraints. So there's so many ways in which we're bound to different systems that are really
all overlapping. They're all inescapable and of their own accord. You can't escape your flesh. You can't escape your mind. You can't escape your brain. You can't escape your experience in life that you've had up to this point. You can't escape your society to some degree. You can't escape your planet.
Right.
You can't escape your fate. You can't escape your moral. There's so many different things.
But I think that is meaningful, or at least I guess the best argument I could say as to why I think it's meaningful is because you really have no other choice. You're bound to them. It's the situation you're in, so it's the situation you should make the best of.
Slavery.
Right. Well,
slavery. That's why I use the term. I mean, and it doesn't necessarily have to have a negative connotation.
But you can look at it like you're a student, which we've talked about a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge concept too that we can bring up, but really quick, let's bookmark that for a second.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel about, like, do you find meaning in this craziness, or do you feel like it's all meaningless? I don't know how anyone can, honest to God, come to the conclusion that everything is meaningless. Although I was that way when I was 14 or 15 years old, when I first went apostate from my faith. I first started smoking weed when I was 14, hanging out with a scientifically minded person. I was like totally cast aside my faith, and because I was raised Baptist Christian, right? And I don't quite remember how I got to that point, and I quickly escaped it. I quickly found meaning in things and found my own path, right? But
evolutionists always say that nature takes the path of least resistance, and I kind of agree. I think that's true for the most part, especially in an evolutionary sense. But if it's true that nature, which nature encapsulates not just evolution, but the entire substructure of reality, if it takes the path of least resistance, well, it's kind of a philosophical dilemma because there's something rather than nothing. And if something was going to take the path of least resistance, it just would cease to exist. So the fact that in this one circumstance, it defies that must mean that it's meaningful, in my opinion.
Or, yes, I mean, that's a good way to look at it because, for one, if we assume that it would be easier for something to return to the nothingness, then the act of the somethingness going within itself, right?
Because somethingness is complicated.
Right.
But nothingness is kind of, I mean, it's complicated to think about.
Nothingness is complicated. So to the Kabbalists, nothingness is the infinite potentiality for all things. All things are held within the nothingness. So it's like...
But it doesn't have the same intricacies that something has.
Right. There's no nuance there. It's all there. Everything is there and everything is not there at the same time in some weird, like, hyper-contradictory sense, which it's you can't wrap your head around it.
Right.
But
does not compute.
But to say that, I get that. Like, if we assume that somethingness is the path of least resistance is to return to the void, return to the nothingness, then it should have done that.
Right.
But it didn't do that. And so if that rule applied, and it took somehow of its own accord, somehow went within itself to create this multiplicity, this universe that we exist within, where all things are actually part of this one whole somethingness that just sort of like escaped returning to void by defiantly going within and splitting and dividing and making so many copies of itself to where it lost itself in its own self, sort of like arrogantly rebelling against the nothingness, which is very similar to the fall of Adam and Eve and very similar to the fall of Lucifer from the heavens. That's the entire process in Metaphysics 101 without all the religious dogmatic connotations behind it.
Or the symbolism of sacrifice too.
Right. It's like, yeah, I mean, but that's some next level shit. I guess I'm just saying, like, in the very beginning of time when something just came from void and then went within itself rather than going back to the void as some sort of a beyond the rule set activity in which something should have returned to nothing.
Right, exactly.
It just reminds me of those things.
Right.
So
what about you?
I find meaning in everything.
Right.
I feel like although everything is arbitrary.
Yeah, but do you do it because there's obviously utility in it, or do you do it because there's some empirical?
I do it because it's like, yes, there's utility in finding meaning in it. I don't kill myself, right? Or I don't like make bad decisions because I feel like moral dilemmas are completely arbitrary and I just decide to make bad decisions
And hurt people.
Yeah, exactly. I find meaning in all things. I find meaning in even the bad things, and that's part of my shout outs to integral philosophy, Integral 101, ascension from the bad and the good.
And that's my shout out to Jungian psychology as well.
Right, totally. Shout outs Carl Jung, shout outs Ken Wilber, shout outs alchemy, shout outs Hermeticism, all the things. Freemasonry, Kabbalah, it's
Hinduism.
all there. Yeah, it's like shout outs all the systems that help us all become more wholly actualized and better individuals. But yeah, man, I find meaning everywhere because honestly, everything is everything else, in my opinion, and it's very contradictory to say that. Like, obviously, I am not this chair, but to some degree, like, this chair is me because I'm experiencing this chair through the apparatus of my sense perception, which is it's very much connected to and a slave to my being, and my being is very much connected to and slave to whatever this process is that allows this chair to exist within my process.
Right.
You know, and to talk about a little bit about what you said earlier, like it's no matter what we talk about, biology, psychology, emotional states, metaphysics, all these systems that we're slaves to, they're all infinite, right? And we can never escape them. But what is true is they all talk to each other and they all connect and overlap with each other in very mysterious ways. And we don't necessarily know where those changes occur.
Nobody's mapped it out.
It's impossible. So for a good example, it's like here we have in this room, we have light, right? And this light casts shadows, right? So in the light, it's obviously light and bright. And in the shadow, it's obviously dark. But shadows in and of themselves are the perfect middle ground between light and darkness. You can't see anything in darkness.
You're not supposed to be able to see darkness.
Technically, yeah, humans can't really see anything in pitch total black darkness. Right. But I can see the darkness over there in that shadow. And so it's like this weird spectrum between light and dark. But the question is that I would ask, at what point does light become darkness and darkness become light over there in that shadow? And you can't ever quantify it. You can't say, okay, like here's these many photons of light and then there's like these many absences of photons in this space, so here's where the light beam ends and here's where the darkness begins. Like you could try to quantify it, but there's no possible way.
And you also have to acknowledge that you wouldn't have the shadow without the light. So they really need each other. They're part of the same
but
entity.
The I guess what I'm trying to, you're right there, 100%. They're polarized opposites of the same actual phenomenon. But the thing that's occurring, the thing that I'm trying to highlight is you can't quantify where the systems overlap. So you have the physical system of the body and all of these things happening in the phenomenological world, in the manifest world. And then you've got how you feel, which are emotions. And then you've got your mind and your thoughts and how you think. And all of these things are like overlapping systems. And you can't necessarily quantify or determine like where they mix with each other and where they separate from each other. They're all like intertwined in this soup of the same shit. And they all require each other to exist. Like Jacob's ladder, kind of, to give a biblical metaphor or analogy. But I say these things because integral philosophy tries to put it all together in a way where you're not looking for the divisions, but you're looking for like the total picture that's practical.
The overlap.
Because you can never actually find where the overlap occurs. You can't quantify it and dissect it and empirically look at that and break it down to the most simple parts. Because this whole process of unfolding, evolution, ascension is transcendent beyond the process of reductionism. Whereas reductionism is cutting things away and creating separations, ascension is born out of amalgamating the process of things being created. So I guess to give it one last little mention, because I've been talking for a minute and I want you to kind of jump in, to give a metaphor, it's like Pythagoras and the triangle, or the Trinity, the triune, the triple Godhead, the Hindu idea of like Vishnu, Brahma, and
the destroyer, the conserver,
Shiva.
and the glue that keeps them together.
Exactly. This is a concept I talk about all the time. You and I have talked about it constantly. I'm just kind of shouting it out for the viewers now, but it's like Shiva, Brahma, and Vishnu, they're like the tripart God, just destruction, creation, and the glue that holds it all together. And if you try to logically run that system in your head, you can never linearly figure out which one came before the other one, because they all completely need each other in order to all exist to make the system happen. Like I'll run through it really quickly. If you posit that in the beginning was nothing, creation was the first force, but then if it's the path of least resistance for creation to return back into void, because there's nothing that gives creation its own agency, it's like, yeah, here's creation, but then creation just fizzles back out into void because it doesn't have anything to give it its own agency. So creation then creates Vishnu, or like Brahma creates Vishnu, which is the glue, which then allows Brahma to be, right? And Vishnu also allows Vishnu to be through Vishnu's own sort of like Vishnu Brahma self. But in order for Brahma to first come into fruition, and then create Vishnu to like perpetuate itself, there needed to be some separation between Vishnu and Brahma that would separate them totally as two separate, distinct beings. And that would be a force of separation that is Shiva. Shiva would have to be the deity to like cleave, to cut in between them to allow that interaction to occur. And so I don't want to take too long, but ultimately if we ran systems of logical processes through these three deities, from the systems of numbers 0, 1, 2, and 3, we would not be able to find any actual correct succession other than Brahma potentially had to have come first. But then Vishnu would have to have come first for Brahma to have its own agency to move forward in creating Shiva or Vishnu. So it's like, and then maybe Shiva was first because from the infinite void, that's already a state of destruction. That's already a state of utter pure chaos of like infinite nothingness. So like was Shiva an aspect of the void and not a Brahma? So like there's all this like weird intertwined logical fuckery that you can never get around. And it's kind of like a Mobius strip, right? It's kind of like the nature of time and space. It's kind of like, did the chicken come before the egg? It's like, does time and space end, or did it begin, or is it a constant infinitely looping process? These are big questions.
Right. And I think you just kind of elucidated why I find meaning in these things is because I think human beings have a proclivity to find novelty in the things that are complex.
Yes.
You know, that's why we...
And simple.
Yeah, and simple.
That's why Amazon did so well.
But reality is complex.
Sure.
Even the simple aspects of reality are fundamentally complex.
And
so I think
yes.
once you can appreciate that at both levels, it's impossible to not find meaning in everything that you do, kind of like you were saying earlier.
Yeah, I mean, because I do feel like contradiction is at the top of all metaphysical process and is the highest truth that we can obtain with our limited perspectives as humans. Yes, reality is infinitely complex, but it's also extremely simple, or it can be simplified.
Do you think people have an inkling of an idea that that's the case, but they don't necessarily have it fully formulated in their minds? Like, do you think people kind of have a little bit of a grasp of the idea that contradictions are prevalent everywhere, or do you think most people are unconscious of that?
I think that most people are unconscious of that. I think definitely, as maybe it's an egoic thing, maybe it's like because their ideology requires them to latch on to certain systems of knowledge.
But life certainly feels contradictory, even when you're not talking about it from a metaphysical perspective.
Sure. I think it's easy to dissociate from it, though. I think it's easy to just continue moving forward in a pragmatic way. And that's one of my qualms, one of my problems that I have with like materialists or scientists who are completely positive in the way, positive meaning like they only believe something if you can point at it or measure it or it has some tangible manifestation. You know, those people who are completely reductive in the way they look at the world, because it's like there are systems that go outside of other systems, and this is very Gödelian, which I wanted to talk about, but I've rambled for so long already. I'm afraid to continue.
Don't be afraid.
Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. For anyone listening, Kurt Gödel is a mathematician who changed the face of mathematics forever through word games. Some mathematicians criticize him, saying that it's like not real math or whatever. But Kurt Gödel has something called the Incompleteness Theorem.
Right.
There's a few of them. In Kurt Gödel's second Incompleteness Theorem, there's two things he proved. One was that there can be truths that exist that are true, of which have no proofs.
Right, which can never be quantified, which can never be empirically proven. They're just true, and we all kind of accept them as true, but we just can't prove them. Can you give an example?
Like anything. What color is this chair?
It's brown.
Can you prove that it's brown?
No, and I also can't prove that the brown that you see is the same brown that I see. Right.
So it's a very mundane example,
right,
in my opinion, of what he accomplished with word games and mathematics and syllogisms and stuff. But that's the first thing. The other thing that he actually kind of proved with his system is that there are no enclosed, completely self-sustaining systems that exist in reality anywhere. What that means, ultimately, is that there are no things that exist of their own accord. Like if you have a system of numbers, in order for you to understand what a system of numbers is, that system of numbers somehow has to, like, in and of itself cannot exist. It has to go outside of its own process and then reflect back upon itself through some other system in order for its system to be made understood and to be continued and perpetuated and actually exist. So sort of like what we were saying earlier, that there's levels and levels and layers and layers, and we don't necessarily know where one layer begins and one layer ends all the time. It's this infinitely propagating popcorn game of more and more evolutionary nuance from a simple system becoming more and more complex, because each system, in order to actually exist and allow itself to continue at like Vishnu and Brahma and Shiva has to create another system that then it reflects back upon itself, and now it can exist. So like when Brahma came into existence, it needed Vishnu, but before it could have Vishnu, it needed Shiva. So then it was like, but before this and before that, then this and this, and then all of a sudden there's like these flashes of infinite, utter insanity, complex things just occurring in which all systems are reflecting on all other systems all at once in this giant soup of like complete mental fuckery, which is basically what Gödel was showing in his own way with his own mathematical system. And with that, it kind of gives me a headache thinking about it.
Right.
Speaking about headaches, I mean, the other day you were telling me about how you get headaches a little bit sometimes, not just from thinking about crazy ideas, but really quick, super swift. Whoop, whoop, whoop.
Well, I already had a headache from what you were just saying, but I'll talk a little bit about it. So, I guess I'll just say, like, I'm really interested in the idea of frequency, and not in the New Age way, just that the idea that scientists are now catching up with, that ancient people have been saying for a long time, is that everything is fundamentally moving energy. It's always vibrating. It's always in motion. That's the Hermetic principle. Everything is motion. And I guess I just find it really crazy when people try to postulate the idea that the frequencies that are emitting from their electronic devices aren't fundamentally causing them problems, whether physically or cognitively. I watched a video where this guy actually showed, and you guys should go look this up, what the frequencies would sound like if you could hear them, if they were amplified to the point they were audible to the human ear. And he also showed what they would look like. And I'll just tell you right now that if you had to experience the frequencies that these phones and these headphones and these microphones emit from a visual and an audible perspective, you wouldn't be around them. You'd go move into the woods where you couldn't hear them.
Fuck this.
Yeah. and so I guess me and BJ were just talking a little bit earlier about how the fact that my fiance and I used to get headaches all the time, and we used to kind of sleep with our phones underneath our pillow because, it's pretty normal to fall asleep, playing a video game on your phone or on Facebook or whatever. And we couldn't figure out why we were getting headaches, but we decided we watched this movie, actually. It's called Resonance, Beings of Frequency. Super new agey, super dogmatic. Definitely take it with a grain of salt, but I highly recommend it. It's free on YouTube. But it kind of influenced us to throw our phones across the room before we fall asleep, and all of a sudden the headache stopped. And at first it seemed mind-blowing, but when you really think about it, it's not that mind-blowing. Like these devices are
new.
The sine waves that they produce aren't compatible with us. Like there's binaural beats where the beats are perfectly attuned to resonate with the human brain or body. Once again, don't know if that's legit or not, but there's also certain waves that we actually know are bad for us, and it kind of reminds me of like the experiments that Schumann did. I don't know if you guys know, but Eric Schumann. Yeah. The Schumann resonance is basically like this resonance that is constantly permeating from between the Earth's crust and the atmosphere. And some spiritual New Age people will, or even Schumann himself, postulated that this frequency is literally the hands that pulled life out of the ground. There's an ancient word in, I think it's Mayan culture, which is the word for human, and it literally means animated earth. So that's
it Gollum? No, it's
Quetzalcoatl, maybe.
No,
that's
one of the
god.
deities.
Yeah, I don't know, but it's this old idea that human beings fundamentally are just animated earth. And one of the things that Schumann did is he took really his healthy college students and he put them in these underground chambers. Sounds kind of creepy nowadays, but he put them there in a place where he knew that they were cut off from the Schumann resonance, and they would start to develop headaches. They would start to develop, like nausea and all these, almost borderline insanity. They almost went crazy. And then, he was like, okay, well, we got to stop this. We got to bring them up. And then he was like, wait a sec. No, I'll just put a frequency radiator down there that emits the Schumann resonance. And sure enough, the moment he emitted the frequency down there, it didn't even need to be the natural one. It could be a synthetic one. All their symptoms went away. And this is well documented. Like anyone can go look this up.
Almost as if like we're, fish swimming in water. Fish don't know that they're in water.
Exactly.
Humans in air don't, we know we're in air, but we don't necessarily know that we're in this soup of crazy electromagnetic frequency.
Exactly.
Which is the truth until we discovered them, right? Through science and through history. But there's a lot to be said. I guess to begin wrapping up, that's really fascinating. And
and also they say, I mean, I don't know if this is 100% true, but this is what Schumann said, was that the frequency that is the one that was my metaphorical hands that pulled us out of being is the same frequency that our brain emits all the time.
Whoa. And doesn't that also have something to do with like mainstream media and the tech companies and sound companies?
Well, there was a German guy who thought that back in the Nazi regime, he thought that the frequency of 432 hertz, which is the frequency that Mozart music resonates at, that's what the radio used to emit. You can go on like a digital audio workforce now, and 432 isn't an option. It's 440, and he purposely did that because he thought it would foster more docile citizens, which would adhere to their cultural laws.
Weird, and we just have adopted that in mainstream. Most people just use 440 as the actual default.
Yeah, and it's in the DAW that we're recording this podcast in, but you won't find 432.
Yeah, wow.
But when you look up binaural beats, the first one that'll come up is 432.
Most people who record them know about this frequency resonance, and they try to
I mean, it sounds so new agey, but
very woo woo.
But there is a lot of documentation about the Schumann resonance and whatnot.
But that's kind of what in conclusion and wrapping up a little bit, I want to express again with integral philosophy, looking at all phenomena in all of the spectrums. And I think about that often. I devote so much of my actual mental capacity every time that I come across something in life. If I have an experience, if somebody cuts me off in traffic, if I get flicked off, if I'm in pain, if I'm having pleasurable sensations, if I just have this incredible idea, whatever happens to me, I'm always trying to like run it through the system of filters of how does this translate to all of the other spectrums of life? How does this translate to all of the other realms or domains of consciousness that I can interface with? And what does that mean? And if I can somehow get this big whole totality image in my head, maybe I can understand it to the degree in which I can actually become a master of my own life and of my own behavioral patterns, my own, whatever it is, just become a master of self. And that's sort of my motivation. And that's why that's how I find motivation in the world as well, I guess, is just that practice. But it just reminds me of that. I'm like, yeah, okay, it sounds woo-woo, but we really don't understand how all of these frequencies play, and we don't understand how I mean, we do and we don't. Maybe there's a lot of things out there that we don't know, and it always is just humbling.
Well, we already kind of talked about how your thoughts and emotions are often, even when you're not conscious of them, they're kind of bestowing themselves upon you, which is kind of like this idea, which is kind of like the idea that like, it's like a frequency that inhabits you. I also think it's a similar metaphor as like God or like deities. Like they're kind of like these memes that exist in the mind space that inhabit you, and you don't really have control over it because you're not meant to. You're unconscious in that regard.
Well, I mean, you're built of those processes outside of those processes.
Right.
We as humans are almost like that extra process of Gödel explaining that we are born out of all of these other crazy processes that existed before us, and they will exist after us. And in order for those processes to reify themselves and to balance themselves, the universe that's this dead matter needed some system of self-awareness in order to perpetuate its own self, like a dream. Like if anybody's ever seen the movie Inception with Leonardo DiCaprio and all the other, like Joseph Gordon-Levitt and all the super cool actors and actresses out there, that movie is all about lucid dreaming. And in the dream, when Leonardo DiCaprio was explaining to the main character's female, I forget her name in reality, he explained to her that dreaming is an act in which the mind produces the dream and experiences the dream subjectively simultaneously as a feedback loop. And that's why Gödel Escher Bach is a really great book for anybody to listen to. Talks about strange loops. It's Hofstadter, a really good book. But yeah, it's this concept of complexity and things being contradictory and things needing each other to exist. And I guess I really am glad that the conversation went this direction because we started out talking about slavery. There's one last thing that I want to say, which is shout outs to Stephen Pressfield. That book changed my life, changed your life.
The War of Art.
Everyone's life that I ever explain it to or show it to. The War of Art, great book. Even Joe Rogan talked about it on his podcast a couple days ago. Blew my mind that he even knew who this author was. Stephen Pressfield is a self-help author. He wrote a book. Long story short, because we're running out of time here, I'll talk about it again, for sure. But essentially, he posited that ideas animate us. We don't animate ideas.
Right.
Like I do not obtain and possess ideas. Ideas possess us.
The oldest form of that quote that I know is from Jung, where he said, "People don't have ideas. Ideas have people."
Yeah, and that happened today on Facebook.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
And I was like, "Oh, that's crazy! Like, oh, I didn't even know that was a Jung quote." It's even older than either of these people.
Right.
This idea, but Yeah, it's kind of like that. There's a meme space, Akashic record, whatever you call it. All knowledge exists there. There's also a subset of that space in which ideas exist that were sort of like born out of that place.
And some people take that to the extreme. Like I read a really new agey book where this woman basically said that she treats her ideas like people. And what I mean by that is if she has an idea that comes to her that she deems what you and I might call a bad idea, she says, no, it's not a bad idea. She tells the idea it's not for me, because she really believes that that ideas kind of like conspire, and if other ideas tell other ideas like, hey,
this guy's a piece of shit.
This guy doesn't like us. I'm not going to come around him.
She personifies ideas in that way.
Exactly.
Which, whether or not it's really real, it probably
has utility
works
for her. Yeah.
Yeah, it probably has very much utility, which is why I really vibe with Stephen Pressfield's idea of ideas animating us and working, every day at something and sitting down and putting in work an hour or two every day,
right, exactly.
Not waiting for inspiration, because the muses, those deities or beings in the meme space that will give us the inspiration, they want to choose someone who's a good antenna.
Right.
Like shout outs to what we said earlier.
Any creative person can attest to that. They'll say that they don't necessarily feel like they're generating the material, whether it be a song or a book or a poem. They kind of feel like they're a conduit or like a bridge between that world and
the bridge, the conduit, the antenna. They're just the receiver. A lot of books are written in the New Age with like channeling and stuff like that.
Right.
For those reasons, very similar. And I really vibe with that idea, whether or not it's really real or if it's just simply a good way to personify something, to understand it in a different light. And it just it brings me back to the idea of slavery, like the idea of being a citizen, the idea of being subject to systems that are larger than you, like
the Schumann resonance.
Exactly, or whatever this concept is, or whatever this body is, or whatever these viewers are, or whatever this thing is that you
and if our thoughts, and if we've already established that everything is vibrating energy, then our thoughts are also part of this universe, and therefore they are also, in some sense,
everything
a
is
frequency.
Just moving about, and it's a very Hermetic principle. Shout outs to Hermetism. We're gonna have a video on that in our lecture series. But
it was the first podcast we ever did on the daily discussion. But it's
when we determined that we vibe.
Right. Exactly.
But yeah, I mean, just to kind of begin wrapping it up, another really good book to read is called Zoom, and that's a book about just like. It's very positivist. It's very materialist. It's not like spiritual or metaphysical at all. It's just about the whole universe in motion from a physical aspect, like molecules, tissues, like insects, everything, wind and pressure.
To reiterate the sentiment I was making earlier about how science has kind of only recently caught on to this idea that everything is always in constant motion, and even at the the quantum level.
The quantum level, right? Which. Side note, atomic theory started actually with pre-Socratic philosophers like Democritus and other people, which is crazy because atomic theory is not something that was like achieved in the 1800s.
Right. The word atom is actually a Greek word that means indivisible, or can be can't be split.
Can't be cut anymore.
Yeah.
But of course, those were just armchair philosophers whose idea of scientific inquiry was much different from what it is today.
Right.
I just wanted to shout that out to anybody who didn't know.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I mean, that being said, I mean, we kind of brought it all back full circle, back to like citizenship, being part of systems that are bigger than you, how you should behave, how do you find meaning in doing things that you don't want to do.
I didn't think it was possible, but we did.
Yeah, I don't even know how we brought it full circle, but we definitely did. And it's like doing things you don't want to do because they go against your own authenticity, or doing things you don't want to do because you feel subjugated to a system that's larger than you. You feel like you're a slave. I wrestle with that every day.
Yeah.
So,
student, slave, same thing, kind of.
And with that, I mean, we kind of exhausted ourselves tonight. There's a lot that can still be unpacked.
Yeah. How are we even going to title this episode?
Man.
We'll figure it out.
Yeah, I don't even know. Like, strange loops, which are actually shackles which chain us to
societal
the
rebellion.
Great chain of being in which we want to rebel from and escape from, but we can never. And the process of trying to escape from it is actually the process in and of itself. And when we learn that, we become enlightened, and then we escape. But then we don't want to because we want to perpetuate it. So then we just do it anyway.
I think that breaks the character limit for YouTube titles.
Bodhisattvas.
Yeah.
Or we'll figure it out.
We'll come back to it. Well, thank you guys for sticking with us through the end of the video. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram. We have a Facebook page. You can also find more of our content on YouTube, Spotify, Google, iTunes, all the platforms.
All of them. And yeah, if you made it to the end of this video, shout outs to you. You are amazing. Comment, like, subscribe, share this with your favorite people, or don't. Let us know how we did. Tell us what you think. If you want to come on to a podcast episode with us, we have the Discourse episodes. Just reach out to us. We'll get you scheduled and we can have a conversation. If you want to talk about something we talked about today specifically, or if you just have something brand new that you want to bring up and discuss with us, let us know.
And thanks for joining us and continuing the great conversation.